Hey friends, before you start yelling at me in the comments about how I told you to stop using the rule of cool, stick with me for a little bit and decide for yourself if you're ready. Today, we're going to chat about why mastering the rules first can actually increase the cool factor in your campaign without turning it into a free-for-all, and how you can make the rule of cool work for you instead of against you. Ready? Let's get to it. Essentially, the rule of cool is that whenever a player asks to perform an action that perhaps is not actually allowed by the rules, but sounds really epic and awesome to you, you say yes. Finding a way to make that happen in your campaign means that a lot of outlandish ideas that the rules wouldn't allow are suddenly allowable. The upside of this is that clearly using the rule of cool is one of the many things that separates having a game run by a human being instead of a game run by a computer, in that the computer can never really know what rules are okay to break, and so it follows all of them, while a dungeon master can make that judgment call to allow something wild and crazy to happen either just once or from then on out. The rule of cool is in some ways exemplified by Matt Mercer and the many shenanigans that have taken place in the Critical Role campaigns. He's become known for being willing to bend the rules in order to make awesome moments happen, but my argument today is essentially that there's a certain degree of base knowledge required in order to be able to use the rule of cool in a way that is actually cool for your games. Not because you wouldn't have fun by doing all sorts of crazy shenanigans, but because your game will be enhanced if you use it with the kind of care and the kind of understanding that experienced dungeon masters like Matt Mercer put into practice. So if understanding the rules first is so important, I guess the big question, of course, is why? If you can remember being a small child playing pretend, or if you happen to be fortunate like me and have a couple of them running around to where you can listen in from a distance, you might recall that those games can be quite wild and crazy. There's typically this one-upping sort of yes and thing going on in a game where both parties are having a good time, where one says, I do this, and says, well, but because of this, I do this, and well, because of that, I do this. You're just constantly creating bigger and bigger situations in order to overcome what the other person had said when you're in any kind of conflict. It can get pretty outrageous, and of course, it's a load of fun, but eventually it devolves into some kind of chaotic mass as the participants either get to a point where they're sick of dealing with one another, or they let something happen and move to the next scene in their little game of pretend. The reason that that is how a game of pretend typically seems to play out amongst the youth is because in pretend, there's no rules. And so essentially every time that you take an action in such a game, what you're doing is creating the rules on the spot. And as you might imagine, 8-year-olds are not necessarily as good at such things as game designers, though I know that might not always feel like it's the case. Knowing the rules of your game is integral to being able to bend them in meaningful ways. If you don't have any rules, or if the rules don't matter, what you really have is a giant game of pretend. In addition, there can be some consequences. First and foremost, there's the confusion that takes over in our players' minds about what the rules are actually going to be. When the rule of cool is consistently applied in place of actual rules knowledge, the players have to essentially guess how the world works. That's not so bad when you're dealing with things that align closely enough to real-world physics, but it can be a problem when you start trying to utilize things that are more gamey, more fantastical. When players are trying to accomplish feats of superhuman strength, because there's no analogy in the real world, they're relying on you to tell them how the world works because the rules no longer do. When magic is involved, again, if you don't have a codified set of rules for them to refer to, they have to guess how their spells are going to affect the world every time, and hope that you are going to favor them this time with their interpretation. The second consequence to overusing the rule of cool is the inconsistency that pops up at the table. Most of the time when we're in the midst of rewarding a creative idea, we aren't necessarily coming up with a codified set of rules that is going to make this idea possible the next time. Sometimes we won't allow it the next time, and our players can only guess as to when that might be, and other times we just simply didn't kit it out enough to have the full detailed mechanics of how it's going to work so that players can make a second attempt with some degree of accuracy. No, instead we just make up the rules for that one precise moment, have the glorious memory to take with us, and then leave our players guessing about what kind of ruling we're going to make next time that same situation or something close to it comes back up. A third consequence that's often overlooked is how the rule of cool can sometimes inadvertently favor one player over another, because not all of our players are going to be as interested in bending the rules versus following them, and not all of them are necessarily going to be as creative in the expression of their character's actions. We subtly shift our efforts to favor the players that are going to use the rule of cool versus those players who are going to engage with the game the way that it was actually designed. This might not seem like much, but over the course of time, it can be frustrating to see that the highlighted actions of the players are only falling upon those players who speak up with crazy ideas and convince you to let them do it. This uneven playing field of perceived favoritism is just no fun for the players that are left on the low side. On the topic of uneven playing fields, if you're looking to level up your games, don't forget to like and subscribe. One of the reasons that we lean so hard at times into the rule of cool is because we as Dungeon Masters can start seeing rules as limits upon the options available to our players instead of viewing them as tools. In actuality, those rules are exactly the kinds of tools that we need, especially if we want a game that includes a solid and enjoyable story. We need to switch our viewpoint from seeing the rule of cool as this awesome sweet treat dessert that we can dive into and enjoy, and instead as a very potent spice that, sprinkled carefully amongst our games, can be a load of fun, but if you dump too much on, it completely ruins the dish. Striking a balance between the exciting narrative moments and the integrity of the rules of the game is the balancing act that marks a good dungeon master. And all it really takes to make that happen is for us to switch our mindsets and focus upon learning and utilizing the rules of the game wherever possible, and then using our best judgment to change things when the rules really need to change, but only when we know how it should be ruled in the first place. I'll have some advice for you in a little bit on how to do just that, but first I want to share a couple of stories from my own games where the rule of cool in one case completely derailed my entire campaign, and in the other case things worked out for the better. First, the downside. I was running a Descent into Avernus campaign with a bunch of interesting and varied players. They got together and started their first session, and everybody seemed to be having a good time, but one player in particular seemed to have been trained to never think of the normal solution and to disregard the typical way that the rules worked every single time. Coupled with another player who had clearly been trained that yes and was the only correct answer for a player of Dungeons & Dragons, and this player started to dominate every scenario with weird and wacky suggestions, and he was constantly looking to create chaos because he had never been taught that there would be any consequences. He didn't seem capable of seeing consequence as a thing in the game, and didn't seem to be able to look at the rules as a framework for him to choose his choices instead of just as inconveniences along the way. He stopped being able to predict how the world would react because there was no framework for him to work inside of. His push towards the rule of cool thinking and the yes and mentality eventually led to the collapse of that entire game, and it is one of my least proud moments as a professional dungeon master. But some positive applications of the rule of cool that my players highlighted when I asked them in my Discord server was stuffing a spellcaster's mouth full so that they couldn't use verbal components, jumping down into a web spell in order to use it as a safety net, throwing corpses at the enemy while giant-sized as a Rune Knight fighter, and of course sticking a wand up a giant's backside in order to avoid burning his friend in front when he triggered it. Suffice to say, the rule of cool can bless our games or hurt them depending on how much we train our players to look within the framework or to look outside it, and rewarding that with consequence-free behavior. And that, of course, leads to advice on how we can use the rule of cool to enhance our games. Don't mind her, she decided she wanted to join in for this bit. As I mentioned a little previously, one of the best ways to manage the rule of cool is to include appropriate consequences. By letting people think outside the box, but have some sort of additional risk, we ground our players just a little bit more and allow them to figure out whether or not it's worth it to go outside the framework in this particular instance. This can be as simple as decreasing an action's odds of success in order to get the cool option that's being presented, or some kind of damage taken by the character, but adding a balance on the backside for when the rules are being broken helps to make people look for the cool solutions that the rules already allow, and then bend outside of those in the moments when it's really going to be narratively awesome. If you're a new DM, some of the best things that you can do to manage the rule of cool is to spend time actually learning the rules as written. And there's a number of ways to do that. Reading the rules is actually about as effective as you might expect, and running games is second to none in giving you the crash course. It's definitely okay to let your players help you in learning the rules, but it's also important that you fact check on anything that you didn't know so that you can put them together after the fact and decide exactly what was the rule, how it was supposed to go. Write down rules questions you don't know the answer to, and then make a ruling. Promise to circle back and actually do so after you've researched it. This allows you to bend in the moment when you need to, but warns the players that you're going to figure out what the rules are so that you can run a game that's closer aligned. Nowadays, Google is your friend. Feel free to tell your players that you're going to make a 30-second search in order to figure out how the rules should work in a situation before you decide what's going to happen, and give yourself permission to pause those 30 seconds to figure out how something's supposed to go. Over time, you'll do this less and less and less, and your game's pacing will be okay. Ultimately, what it boils down to is what I call the rule of cool, which is if you don't know how the rules should rule in the situation that you're being asked to adjudicate, then you're just making things up. So either find out or rule conservatively. Like many aspects of dungeon mastery, how you apply the rule of cool at your table is probably going to be a somewhat contentious and very opinionated topic. I would love to hear your opinion down in the comments section and to talk to you about it. Don't worry, I know I'm not going to convince everybody that my way is the right way, but if this video can help even one player to be able to get the spotlight despite the player at the table that pushes for strange and wonderful things, or if it can help one DM to feel empowered to run a game closer to the rules and to stretch in those moments where they feel that it warrants it, then I'll feel like this has been a pretty successful video. Because I want to see creativity and structure in our games so that we can all improve our games of Dungeons & Dragons together. Thanks for watching, and happy adventuring.